Hey, this is Jacob Evan. Thanks for tuning in. Today we are going to consider the topic of the pressure of culture. In our society today, all of us are probably aware that there's this push to change the culture. And without getting too much into the specifics of it, there's this push to redefine how we think about certain things and to redefine what is considered normal, whether it be the normal way that things are done or the normal way that things are thought about. And with some of those ideas and practices, it's very obvious to us because we can just see it constantly talked about in the news and shows on the internet, or even if we don't watch those things, we can see it reiterated by the people that do watch those things. And we can readily see those ideas being reaffirmed over and over across different contexts. Even though we may recognize that, for the vast majority of people, the 99% or more, they just kind of go along with the crowd or what they imagine to be the crowd. So that repetition and that cultural push has a definite impact on their thinking. But I would even go so far to say that if we are exposed to it enough, it has an effect on all of us and how we think, regardless of any level of intelligence, regardless of whether we agree with it or not. You may have even noticed this with people that strongly oppose certain ideas from this new culture. You may have noticed that they will often adopt the terminology of the very people that they oppose, or that they will often end up confining their thinking into the very box that the other side has made for them. My point is that these cultural pushes and cultural shifts have a strong effect even whenever certain people initially disagree, and part of that power is the repetition of those beliefs and the continued reinforcement of them. In this video, I'm going to talk about the ideas of Torah culture, cultural pressure, and specifically the ideas of correction and rebuke. The first thing I need to clarify is, what do I mean by Torah culture? And this could be a very wide-ranging topic, but looking at it in brief, we first need to recognize that the Torah is not just a guide to individual morality. It's not just a document that tells each individual how to serve Elohim, how to worship God. It actually goes further than that. It describes how an entire nation of people is supposed to do that, and how they're supposed to interact with each other within the nation, and how they're supposed to interact with people outside of the nation. It doesn't just say what a person is supposed to do or not do, but it also says how the community, how the nation is supposed to respond whenever a person does or doesn't do a certain thing, such as with how the judicial system works, for example. Since the Torah is relevant to an entire nation as a nation, if his nation were to genuinely seek to follow it, the Torah has a culture for the people that might be implied by it, and by extension, it has a potential to create a culture based simply upon how people respond to the commands. Those are, in effect, two distinct Torah cultures that I'm referring to. The first one is built into the language of the Torah. Language is one of the key factors in a culture, so the language that it was originally written in is critically important, and on top of that, the terminology which is used and further defined within the Torah is also important. That side of the culture is defined by the words and by the text, and it may also include cultural norms that existed prior to the Torah being delivered to the people. Of course, what I typically try to focus on with regard to this is the text of the Torah and the wordings used in the text. The other type of culture I refer to is based on how people might respond to the Torah, how people might respond to the Torah being enforced in a society. To be completely clear, I'm not saying that this is necessarily a part of the Torah, nor am I saying that it's implied by the Torah. I'm simply recognizing that certain commands being enforced might have certain effects on what people do in that society, even apart from observance of any particular command. Some people coming from the culture that we've been raised in are troubled by certain practices in the Torah, for example, about marriage or about how divorce is handled or about certain cases of forced marriage. Just looking at a command in isolation and imagining it being applied in this current society is not going to give us a good idea of the whole picture that would realistically be there, especially in a society where observance has already been going on. I'm certainly not suggesting that we should just imagine that everything's going to be perfect, or just imagine that no one's going to do anything wrong in the Torah observant society. I'm not suggesting that we just imagine that. But what I am suggesting is that we recognize there might be other shifts in the culture that accompany those commands, even if they are not actually a part of the command itself. With regard to a nation or a society observing the law or starting to observe the law, there will certainly be an adaptation period in that society where they're still learning, they're still recognizing and realizing the commands, but at a certain point, it's not like everyone is just going to go about their lives blind to what the Torah commands are, and people will begin to realize what consequences there might be to certain situations. People that are aware and mindful are going to adjust what they're doing in recognition of those commands. Considerate people are going to do things to help avoid bad outcomes for themselves or their sons or their daughters, as the case may be. They're going to act in response to the commands. As a result, those measures are going to influence the culture. Not only do the commands themselves affect the culture, but the response to those commands affect the culture. Of course, along the way, we always have to be mindful of not changing the Torah, not adding to the Torah, not taking away from the Torah. Regardless of what we personally are doing in response to the command, for example, we might be extra careful about something and then go beyond what it says knowingly, and then we might start to forget the text of the command itself, and that the text only says so much. It may not say those extra things that we've been doing, or it may not say those supposed reasons that we may have thought were the reasons why the command existed, things we previously assumed despite the actual text not saying so. We have to remember what the text of the command itself is, because not only do we want to make sure that we're not adding to the Torah like it talks about in Deuteronomy 4:2, but in that setting of a Torah society, there can be very real consequences for other people, because that will affect matters of judgment and justice. It's not just about us doing whatever is right in our own sight in that situation. In the Torah society, they need to be enforcing the actual Torah in the nation, not the thing that we have generated or imagined in response to the Torah. Whether that thing is the extra precautions we might have taken, or the reasons that we might have imagined for a command, or the response that we have to the enforcement of the command. We have to make sure to distinguish between the text of the command and everything else. So that is an introduction to some of my thinking about the culture of the Torah and the Torah society, and some of my thinking about possible effects and possible responses to commands in such a society. I think there is a lot to this that's worth thinking about, but for now I want to lead into the main point of this discussion, which is regarding correction and rebuke. Right now, everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. When I say that, I don't mean that everyone is doing the wrong thing, or that everyone has the wrong intent, or anything like that. Everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. As far as people that are concerned about observing the Torah, each of us has our own way of handling that. We either look to the Torah text and work regularly at understanding it and understanding the words and phrases of the time, or people prioritize certain sources or other books that tell them what to do, or some people look to certain people or look to the group that they are in to tell them what to do. We are not in the Torah nation that actually has the Torah enforced as the rule of law, with the authorities, being the judges and the priesthood at the tent of meeting, determining how the commands are understood or applied. We're not in that situation, and for most of us, we're not in any semblance of that situation right now. That is why I'm saying that everyone is doing what is right in their own eyes. However, we have this command in Leviticus 19:17. It says that you shall surely correct your associate, or you shall surely rebuke your companion, with the associate or companion likely being a person of your people or of the nation. It also says after that, and you shall not bear guilt for sin with him. Or it could be understood as, you shall not allow sin upon him, or you shall not incur sin because of him. Some people interpret this as just relating to the previous command about not hating your brother in your heart, that is supposedly just about making your brethren know that you don't hate them. Personally, based in part on the second portion regarding not bearing guilt or not allowing sin, how I would understand this is that we are expected to correct our fellows onto the right path, onto following the Torah correctly. Presumably that means if we know about some issue of the commands that someone who is a part of the people is ignoring or not aware of, or is misinterpreting, or is doing wrong because they think they have no choice but to do what they are doing, then it appears to be required of us to step in and correct or rebuke them. Of course, this probably goes against the culture that many of us have been brought up in and have been programmed to think according to. And also it probably reminds us of all kinds of less than ideal situations that look similar to that. I want to consider those things, and I also want to consider some other possible ways of thinking about it. For me, whenever I think about correction and rebuke, I can think about some instances where it seemed like the person came across very rudely or very hurtfully. I can think of the idea of the busybody and how some people take it upon themselves to call people out on stuff, seemingly just to make themselves feel useful or maybe just to bring other people down to how they're feeling. I can also think about certain people on the internet that all they seem to do is look for things they don't like, and once they've found something, then they complain about it and verbally attack the person for the rest of their day, it seems. There are a lot of other situations where something like this is done, something that might resemble rebuke or correction, things which are far less than ideal. Also, on the flip side of it, there are situations where correction or rebuke is done and the response is far less than ideal. Regardless of whether it was presented well to begin with, sometimes people feel personally attacked because it resembles some other situation in their mind. I can think of situations where the person would dismiss it as an attempt to just hurt that person. I can think of situations where the person being corrected would try to kind of fire back with their own rebuke, oftentimes coming up with stuff that's just completely unrelated to any actual command, seemingly doing this to just save face on some level. I've also witnessed a situation where someone felt the need to just start berating another person and personally attacking them at length, simply because that person was trying to follow this command of correcting your fellow, even though the person doing the berating supposedly believed in following the Torah. I can also think about situations where I was either confronted about something or corrected about something, and in the past, in that moment, I felt kind of like put on the spot and I didn't know exactly what to say, or I said something strange or wasn't reasoned out because my brain seemingly shut off at least part of it. On the other hand, despite these other examples, I can think of examples that went reasonably well. One situation was online, and I remember prefacing the correction by saying something about how the reason I'm doing this is because I care about the command, and I perceive that you also care about the commands and care about doing them. And from my understanding, we should be doing such and such, or not doing such and such. The response from the person was that she actually accepted that this was a genuine and sincere statement, which of course it was. And she may have said something about how she would think about it or look into it. I don't recall precisely. Another example, whenever I first started getting into the Torah, there was someone that helped guide me in the beginning, and at one point I saw him out in public and there was something which he did that I understood as an issue of a command, and so I felt it would be the correct thing to do to point that out to him. His response is etched into my memory. I remember him saying, "I accept your correction." Of course, there are also other situations where there might have been some disagreement about how a command was interpreted, and sometimes that's going to be inevitable, and sometimes those disagreements are reasonable. Taking it a step further, this can also start to get into a cultural attitude that many of us have to some degree or another, which is, I just want to be left alone. This seems to come up often with people whose ancestors tended to live in rural areas, or their ancestors moved around in different countries where the rulers often did not align with them. It makes sense why people would have this cultural belief, this idea that we just want to be left alone to do our own thing, and we will leave other people alone to do their own thing, and we will be polite so long as no one interferes with us, and if they leave us alone, we won't interfere with them. There is utility in having that view now. There are benefits to holding that view depending on the situation, but there are also potential issues with it, especially in the context of following the Torah and being around other people that believe in following it. The reality is that there are not very many of us. There are very few people that recognize the Torah and desire to follow it. Add on to that the fact that there are many contentions in our midst, whether the rabbinic traditions are authoritative, whether the New Testament has any relevance, what the calendar is supposed to be, how the name is pronounced, or what titles you should or should not use for Elohim, etc. Everyone has their own threshold also as to what they're willing to be around or with whom they're willing to associate, even within this already very limited scope of people that care about the written Torah. Now, I can understand how people might just, cut other people off because they see something as just an irreconcilable difference or an egregious offense of the law or of God. However, I also wonder, how is this going to work out in the long run, or even in the relatively near future? Living the way that we are right now may seem to work in that narrow view, but if circumstances significantly changed, it may require us to rethink these things. For example, I'm aware of a story about two groups of people living near each other in Russia in the decades preceding the communist uprising. The one group was Jewish, and the other group shared some similarities with what we would call Messianic Jewish today. They had their own separate communities, but apparently they were willing to cooperate with each other to some degree. The cultural norm was to avoid contact as much as possible with the other outsiders, and obviously with the violent marauders, but these two groups were willing to deal with each other. They preferred each other to the alternative. Now, I don't know how relevant this story is to other people, especially right now, but it came to mind and I thought it might be worth wondering about. So I accept that this is a complicated situation, but getting back to the command on correction, it makes sense that there would be a command to do this because the nation and the community would need to continue following the law and not start sliding off track. It would make sense that if the community were just hiding their eyes while others were sinning, it would clearly be a problem and create future problems. Therefore, as I imagine it, there would be this need to follow such a command and have people be willing to alert others when maybe they're not aware of some issue of command, maybe they're not aware of what they're doing, or maybe they've just convinced themselves that they have to do what they are doing. In reality, they may actually need some kind of outside pressure to oppose that. As I mentioned, there's this definite force in society which compels people to do things according to the culture and to think according to the culture. If it's something which is ever present and it's reiterated frequently and is apparently the accepted way of people, it has a definite effect on the people at large. This can be there even if it's just one person speaking up in that moment. This reminds me somewhat of the idea of shame. Shame is often thought of as a bad thing, but shame can serve a useful purpose. Of course, it's not so useful when a person is ashamed of doing good things or overly ashamed of making mistakes that don't matter, but a person can also feel shame placed on them from society because they are doing things which are morally bad or are unwise, or because they're starting down that path. Without getting too controversial, one might consider how people are shamed for using alcohol or other drugs in an unrestricted way. People are shamed for being morbidly obese, and obviously that's a dangerous behavior. But of course, people are trying to change that now. Sources of shame like these are clearly unwise things to do, and of course, there are some people that have personal things which complicate their situation, but going beyond that, there are many people who are steered away from those things because the pressure of the shame and the culture affects them. It doesn't necessarily matter how intelligent the person is or how they reason things out. The effect is still there. As an example of this in action, I know someone who's not observant, but I consider him to be intelligent, and without getting into too many of the details, he was telling me about how he was very uncomfortable with these modern ideas of women having multiple relationships at the same time, and there not actually being any commitment anymore. But he also apparently felt that pressure from society and from this new culture, and he seemed to feel like this must just be the way things are now, that this is just what he should expect, and this is just supposedly how things should be. It seemed to me that he was kind of divided because he felt the force of the new culture, and at the same time he had these contradicting feelings that told him something was wrong. This kind of cultural pressure and shame compels people to conform even despite their own thinking. It compels them to conform their thinking, and it compels people to reinforce those same ideas on their fellows. It's very powerful. To clarify, I'm not saying that we should just go around and shame people, but we can surely see how such a thing, even though that's not necessarily done in the ideal way that we may prefer, we can see how it would have an effect on people at large within a society or community, that 99% of people I referred to earlier. Consider if that sort of energy were put toward teaching obedience to the Torah, compelling people to not stray from the Torah, and instead of shaming people for trying to follow the Torah, including not shaming people that are trying to follow this very command about correcting your fellow, consider if that energy were used to encourage people to accept legitimate correction, or to encourage at least tolerating correction, even if it may not be legitimate. So going into practical terms, this reminds me about an idea that I used to have regarding this command. I thought at one time that maybe if I corrected someone once and they kept violating the command despite that, maybe I'd done my part by telling them once and maybe that was enough. When I think about it now, I'm not so sure about that. I'm very hesitant to believe that now because I've recognized that people respond to repetition even when they think they don't. People respond to being consistently reminded of something. Obviously, it doesn't mean that it's going to go well with every person or every time. However, consider these two different situations. Someone that you associate with that cares about the Torah on some level might hear your correction one time and say that that prompts them in that moment to excuse their disobedience in one way or another, and then you decide to never bring it up again. As a result, they may never be prompted to think about it again. If they are never prompted about it again, then does it really matter that you gave them some logical reason that one time or that you told them about it that one time? Compare that with a situation where the correction is brought up multiple times, even regularly, as the violation is witnessed or referenced. Of course, ideally, such a thing would involve all of your social skills and handling it the best way that you can. Obviously, it's possible that there may be a bad response regardless, but on the other hand, eventually there starts to be this association. Eventually, it's something that's more likely to come up in that person's thinking. Now, something which often happens whenever a person is exposed to some particular idea over and over and over is that they will start unintentionally rethinking that issue. Once they do that, they often convince themselves that it had nothing to do with those annoying corrections that that person was doing, or it has nothing to do with those ideas that the person kept mentioning that were previously foreign to them. In their mind, the person that did the influence was themselves. It was entirely their own independent reasoning which caused them to change and do differently. But in reality, the continued exposure to that idea made the difference. And knowing that is something which goes on, I'm not comfortable with just trying to supposedly do my job by doing the command once and then thinking I can leave it at that. If I really believe in observing the Torah, trying to keep people on track, trying to get people on the right track, then I know that continued reinforcement matters. Shouldn't we consider that in how we apply this command? That closes out what I wanted to talk about regarding culture, regarding pressure from the culture and from the society, and how that relates with the Torah, and specifically with this command in Leviticus 19:17. Hopefully there is some food for thought in this presentation, whether it be with regard to how we might follow this command, how we might relate to others in the community, or how we are defining community, or whether it be in relation to these ideas of influence and how there might be effects from the commands within an observant society that would generate a culture as a result. Thanks for watching. Stay focused and be tenacious.